When people speak of a man who truly lived well, Robert Redford's name rises to the top. The legendary actor and filmmaker passed away in the early hours of September 16th at the age of 89. His death not only sent shockwaves across the world, but also left his family grappling with unimaginable grief. Yet, while his loved ones navigate this heartbreaking moment, troubling revelations have surfaced about his autopsy. Initial reports painted a peaceful picture, claiming Redford slipped away quietly in his sleep. But the official autopsy tells a different, far more unsettling story. So what did the examination really uncover? And what happened to Redford in those final hours? Join us as we pull back the curtain on the truth behind his last moments. Robert Redford, the man behind the legend. For decades, Robert Redford stood as Hollywood's golden figure, the face behind some of the greatest films ever made. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, The Way We Were, and All the President's Men. With his windswept hair, effortless charisma, and undeniable presence, he wasn't just a leading man. He was the leading man of the late 60s and 70s. But Robert Redford's story was never just about fame. He was a gifted filmmaker, a political activist unafraid to speak his truth, and the visionary who built the Sundance Film Festival, forever reshaping independent cinema. Over a career that stretched across 6 decades, Redford collected 2 Academy Awards, including an honorary one in 2002, alongside 3 Golden Globes, one of them being the prestigious Cecil B. DeMille Lifetime Achievement Award in 1994. Yet awards only told a fraction of his story. What truly defined him was his relentless drive to create, inspire, and leave the world a little better than he found it. But before Hollywood knew him as Robert Redford, he was Charles Robert Redford Jr., born August 18, 1936, in Santa Monica, California. His roots were a mix of Irish, Scottish, and English ancestry, woven together by hard-working families who crossed oceans in search of something better. His father, Charles Sr., was an accountant, while his mother, Martha, carried warmth and strength that shaped the man he would become. Tragedy would hit young Redford early. His mother passed away when he was just a teenager, leaving a void he carried throughout his life. The Redfords lived in Van Nuys, and when his father's work took them to El Segundo, Robert learned the balance of structure and struggle. Childhood visits to his grandfather in Austin, Texas, sparked something deep inside him, a love for nature and the environment that would later define his activism. He often credited those Texas landscapes with teaching him to see the world differently, with respect and reverence. At Van Nuys High School, Redford wasn't the star student. By his own admission, he was a bad one, restless, distracted, and hungry for something beyond textbooks. He found his joy in sports and art, swinging tennis balls with Pancho Gonzalez at the Los Angeles Tennis Club and sketching when the classroom felt too small for his imagination. Life tested him early, too. At just 11, he battled a mild case of polio, an experience that taught him resilience before he even understood the word. In 1954, Redford graduated from high school and headed to the University of Colorado in Boulder. But his time there was short-lived. A half-scholarship kept him afloat for a while, but his love of drinking and rebellious streak caught up with him. He lost his scholarship, and soon after, his place at the university. But what looked like failure was really just the beginning of Redford's wild, unpredictable path. He left the familiar behind and drifted through Europe, chasing experiences rather than accolades. He lived in France, Spain, and Italy, soaking up culture, art, and the raw lessons of life. That journey reshaped him, and eventually, it brought him back to New York City. He studied painting at Pratt Institute, chasing the artist within him before turning his attention to acting at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. By 1959, the restless boy from Van Nuys was on his way to becoming one of the greatest storytellers Hollywood had ever known. How Robert Redford conquered Hollywood. When you talk about Hollywood legends, Redford's name sits right at the top of the list. He wasn't just an actor. He was a storyteller, a director, an activist, and a man who carved his own lane in an industry that often tried to box him in. Redford didn't just play characters, he became part of the cultural fabric of America. But before he was a superstar, Redford was just another struggling actor in New York City, hustling his way through auditions, looking for the next big break. His journey started on the stage. In 1959, he made his Broadway debut with a small role in Tall Story. It wasn't a headline-making performance, but it opened the door. That same year, he landed parts in The Highest Tree and later Sunday in New York in 1961. These roles might not have made him a household name, but they gave him what every actor needs: momentum. Then came the breakthrough. In 1963, he joined the original cast of Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park, playing opposite Elizabeth Ashley as her uptight newlywed husband. The show was a hit, and Redford's charm stole the stage. Broadway had finally found its golden boy. At the same time, Redford was quietly building a resume on television. From 1960 onwards, he appeared in nearly every big drama series of the era: Naked City, The Untouchables, Maverick, Alfred Hitchcock Presents, Perry Mason, The Twilight Zone, you name it. Redford popped up on it. He was grinding, putting in the work, and proving he could adapt to any role Hollywood threw his way. By 1960, he made the leap to the big screen with Tall Story, reprising his Broadway role. Acting alongside Anthony Perkins and a young Jane Fonda, it was a modest debut, but it put him on the map. Soon after, he stretched his range with a powerful performance in the TV drama The Voice of Charlie Pont. That role earned him an Emmy nomination for Best Supporting Actor, his first big recognition in the business. By the mid-1960s, Redford was climbing fast. He starred in War Hunt in 1962, held his own next to Alec Guinness in the dark comedy Situation Hopeless, but Not Serious, and delivered a breakout film performance in Inside Daisy Clover in 1965, opposite Natalie Wood. His role as a troubled movie star won him a Golden Globe for Best New Star. Hollywood was starting to take notice. From there, his career exploded. He teamed up again with Natalie Wood in This Property is Condemned, and that same year shared the screen with Jane Fonda and Marlon Brando in The Chase. With every role, Redford built a reputation as more than just a handsome face. He was versatile, intelligent, and unpredictable. But 1969 would change everything. That year, he starred in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid alongside Paul Newman. The film was an instant classic and cemented Redford as a leading man. His role as the quick-witted Sundance Kid made him a global star, winning him a BAFTA, and more importantly, creating one of the most iconic partnerships in cinema history. Redford wasn't content to coast on success, though. Through the 1970s, he carefully crafted his career, turning down typecast roles in films like The Graduate and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. He wanted to be more than the blonde, all-American pretty boy. Instead, he picked projects that challenged him and expanded his range. And it worked. Between 1972 and 1976, Redford went on one of the greatest box office runs in Hollywood history. He starred in Jeremiah Johnson, The Candidate, and the romantic drama The Way We Were with Barbra Streisand. Then came The Sting in 1973, which reunited him with Paul Newman. The film was a monster hit, becoming the top-grossing movie of 1974 and earning Redford his first and only Oscar nomination for Best Actor. At the same time, his performance in The Great Gatsby showed he could bring classic literature to life, while 3 Days of the Condor proved he could dominate the thriller genre. By the end of the 70s, Redford wasn't just a star, he was the biggest name in Hollywood. But then, he did something most actors wouldn't dare. He stepped behind the camera. In 1980, Redford directed his first feature film, Ordinary People. The drama about a family unraveling after tragedy shocked critics and audiences with its raw emotional depth. Mary Tyler Moore delivered the performance of her career. Timothy Hutton won an Oscar, and Redford himself walked away with the Academy Award for Best Director. His very first time behind the camera, and he took home Hollywood's top prize. That was Redford in a nutshell. Fearless, focused, and impossible to ignore. And as if conquering Hollywood wasn't enough, Redford was quietly building something even bigger behind the scenes: the Sundance Film Festival. What started as a small gathering in Utah turned into the largest independent film festival in America. Sundance became a launchpad for countless filmmakers, from Quentin Tarantino to Steven Soderbergh, and reshaped the movie industry by giving indie voices a platform. Redford didn't just participate in Hollywood, he changed it. And just when people thought they'd seen it all, Redford joined the Marvel Universe in 2014. Playing the villain Alexander Pierce in Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Even in blockbuster territory, his gravitas shone through. By 2018, Redford announced his retirement from acting, capping off his career with The Old Man and the Gun, where he played a charming bank robber. A fitting nod to the Sundance Kid, who started it all nearly 50 years earlier. It felt like the perfect bookend to one of the most remarkable careers in film history. But Robert Redford's legacy wasn't measured only in films or awards. Over the years, he was showered with honors: the National Medal of Arts, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a Golden Lion from Venice, Kennedy Center honors, and honorary degrees from some of the world's most prestigious universities. Time magazine even named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world in 2014. Yet through it all, Redford never forgot where he came from. His love for nature and the environment, born during those boyhood trips to Texas, guided much of his activism. He used his fame and influence not just to entertain, but to protect the planet and support causes he believed in. And that's why, when the world looks back on Robert Redford, it won't just remember the films. It'll remember the impact. The man who gave us Sundance. The man who redefined what it meant to be a leading man. The man who never stopped pushing for something greater. Robert Redford didn't just play heroes on screen. In his own way, he became one. Robert Redford's love life and the women who defined him. When it comes to Hollywood, few stories are as captivating as Robert Redford's. Not just his legendary career, but also the women who walked beside him, shaped him, and left lasting imprints on his life. Behind the actor, director, and activist was a man who loved deeply, endured heartbreak, and found companionship in unexpected places. Redford's love life wasn't about scandals or quick romances. It was a journey of devotion, loss, reinvention, and ultimately a love that carried him into his later years. Robert Redford's love story began in the late 1950s, long before the world knew him as Sundance. Fresh from his time in Paris, where he immersed himself in art and culture, he returned to Los Angeles, and that's where fate stepped in, bringing him face to face with a young historian named Lola Van Wagenen. Their meeting felt almost like a scene from one of his films. He was a restless, budding artist searching for direction, and she was a bright, passionate woman dedicated to education and activism. The spark was instant. By 1958, in a modest ceremony, Robert Redford and Lola were married. At the time, he hadn't even appeared in a single film, but their union was built not on Hollywood fame, but on shared values and genuine affection. Shortly after, the couple moved to New York City, where Redford studied art at Pratt Institute before stumbling upon the craft that would change his life: acting. Together, they built both a family and a future. Their lives were filled with promise, but tragedy struck early. In 1959, their first son, Scott Anthony, died just 2 months after his birth. It was a devastating loss, one that stayed with them forever. Still, they pressed forward, raising 3 more children: Shauna, James, and Amy. Through the 1960s, as Redford worked his way through theater, television, and eventually Hollywood films, Lola remained his anchor. By the time Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid exploded in 1969, making him a household name, she was there, steady and supportive. To the public, they seemed like the perfect family. But behind the scenes, fame began to take its toll. The 1970s and 80s were Redford's golden years on screen. With The Candidate, The Way We Were, All the President's Men, and Out of Africa, he became one of the biggest stars of his generation. But at home, the pressures of celebrity life, constant travel, and the weight of raising a family began to crack the foundation of his marriage. After 27 years of marriage, they separated quietly in 1985, finalizing their divorce without scandal or drama. Redford later reflected that their split was mutual and necessary, though the affection remained. He described it as moving on while still holding on to love, friendship, and respect. Lola went on to remarry in 2002 to diplomat George Burrell, while continuing her career as a historian and documentary producer. And although their paths diverged, Lola's Utah roots would forever influence Redford, inspiring the creation of the Sundance Institute and Festival that became his legacy. In the years following his divorce, Redford's romantic life became quieter. In 1990, though, he was linked to Swedish actress Lena Olin, after the two worked together on Havana. Their relationship lasted about a year before coming to an end. Not long after, he was connected to costume designer Cathy O'Rear in the mid-1990s. Their romance was brief, but it marked a chapter of Redford's life where he seemed to be searching for something lasting again. That lasting love arrived in 1996, when he met Sibylle Sagers at his Sundance Mountain Resort. Sibylle, a German multimedia artist and environmentalist, had come to ski and knew little about the Hollywood icon she was about to meet. She admitted years later that she had only seen a couple of his films, including Jeremiah Johnson and Barefoot in the Park. Before meeting him, she went to rent a handful of his movies, worried he might bring them up over dinner. He didn't, and that, as it turned out, was exactly why Redford was drawn to her. He explained that her lack of familiarity with his career stripped away the Hollywood baggage. They weren't meeting as a movie star and a fan, but as two human beings connecting on even ground. For him, it was a refreshing beginning. For her, it was an unexpected turn toward love. From that moment, Robert Redford and Sibylle Sagers became inseparable. They kept their relationship mostly private, focusing instead on their shared passions for art and environmental causes. In 2008, Redford revealed that they were engaged, and the following year they married in an intimate ceremony in Hamburg, Germany, attended by just 30 close friends and family. Redford described Sibylle as giving him a whole new life, a sentiment he repeated often in his later years. Together, they co-founded The Way of the Rain, an organization blending art and performance to raise awareness about climate change and environmental preservation. They appeared side by side at events around the world, from Cannes to Monaco, not as Hollywood power players, but as partners committed to creativity and activism. Though they never had children together, Sibylle became stepmother to Redford's 3 surviving kids and stood beside him through triumphs and tragedies alike. She was there when he received honors for his environmental work, when his films were celebrated at international festivals, and when he faced the heartbreak of losing James. Their love wasn't built on headlines, but on the kind of companionship Redford had always seemed to be searching for, one rooted in shared purpose and mutual respect. And in the end, for all his fame and accolades, Redford's greatest roles weren't only on screen. They were in the lives he touched, the family he built, and the love he found. Love that carried him all the way to his final days. The untold heartbreaks and losses in Robert Redford's life. Robert Redford has always been that quiet Hollywood figure who preferred to keep his personal life locked away from the spotlight. He let his films do the talking, whether it was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, or All the President's Men. But behind the charm, the fame, and the awards, his life has been shadowed by loss and heartbreak, tragedies that would test anyone's spirit. By the time he appeared on screen in his first film, Tall Story, in 1960, Redford had already endured more than most face in an entire lifetime. And sadly, the years that followed didn't spare him either. As a child in the mid-1940s, Redford knew the kind of fear most kids today can barely imagine. He had polio at just 11 years old, a time when the disease loomed like a dark cloud over every childhood. He once recalled how terrifying it was to see images of children trapped in iron lungs, and how that fear was something you lived with every day before Jonas Salk's vaccine was discovered. Redford himself spent weeks bedridden after pushing his body too far during an ocean swim while sick. Decades later, He would honor Salk's work in a 2014 documentary, describing the vaccine as earth-shattering news because it offered children like him a chance to grow up free from that constant dread. But illness wasn't the only danger young Redford faced. Growing up in Van Nuys, California, he fell into the wrong crowd. He joined a street gang, chasing dares and trouble instead of school books. One dare nearly killed him, a leap from a high building just to prove he wasn't a coward. Somehow, he survived with nothing broken but a new understanding of fear. He later reflected that you could either let fear control you or find a way to push through it. Yet, even after that brush with death, his wild streak didn't immediately end. The gang turned to petty theft, often stealing alcohol, until at 16, Redford was arrested for possessing stolen jewelry. The charges were dropped, but the experience marked the beginning of a slow turn away from that reckless life. Still, hardship wasn't finished with him. At just 19, he lost his mother, Martha, to a hemorrhage connected to complications from a stillbirth years earlier. She was only 40. Redford admitted later that he had been a difficult teenager, yet his mother never gave up on him. He remembered how she always carried faith that he had something in him worth believing in. On stage at the Sundance Film Festival decades later, he confessed that his greatest regret was not appreciating her more while she was alive. He described her adventurous spirit and her smile, saying she passed before he could thank her. Tragedy also came from the loss of another strong figure in his young life, his uncle David. His father, Charles, worked long hours as a milkman, leaving Robert to bond with David, a gifted athlete who spoke several languages. The two would practice football throws together, but their time was cut short. When David went off to serve in World War II, he never returned. In 1945, David was killed when his Jeep came under fire in Luxembourg. Redford once admitted that in his family, grief wasn't openly discussed. You were simply expected to move on, no matter how heavy the loss. By the time Redford reached college, discipline was still far from his strong suit. He attended the University of Colorado on a baseball scholarship, but quickly earned a reputation for hard partying instead of studying. His antics got him kicked out after just 18 months. That setback, combined with his mother's death, pushed him toward a different path. He studied art in Paris and Florence, and eventually trained in drama in New York. It was a shift that changed everything. Even as his career took off, personal sorrow followed. He married Lola Van Wagenen in 1958, and the couple soon welcomed their first child, Scott. But joy turned to devastation when baby Scott died at only 10 weeks old from what would later be called sudden infant death syndrome. Redford carried the pain of that loss for the rest of his life, recalling how, as young parents, they had no understanding of the condition and how it left a scar that never healed. When their second son, James, was born in 1962, tragedy nearly repeated itself. James arrived prematurely with a life-threatening lung condition, the same one that had claimed the life of President John F. Kennedy's infant son. Doctors gave him only a 40% chance of survival. Against the odds, both mother and baby survived, something Redford described as a colossal relief. But the brush with death deepened his sense of how fragile life truly was. The blows kept coming. In 1983, Redford's daughter, Shauna, lost her boyfriend, journalism student Sid Wells, who was murdered execution-style in his apartment near the University of Colorado. The prime suspect, Wells' roommate Thane Smika, was arrested but never charged due to lack of evidence. Decades later, new leads reignited the case, but Smika vanished, and justice never came. Redford later admitted that the tragedy still haunted him, describing it as a door half open with nothing but darkness behind it. On a personal level, even friendships weren't immune from sorrow. Redford had a deep connection with actress Natalie Wood, who had once helped secure him his breakthrough role in Inside Daisy Clover. They shared the screen again in This Property is Condemned, and their bond endured beyond Hollywood. When Wood drowned mysteriously in 1981 during a trip off Catalina Island with Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken, Redford was left devastated. He often spoke of her with warmth, narrating tributes and appearing in a documentary about her life years later, but her loss was one more painful reminder of how suddenly life can change. And perhaps the hardest tragedy of all came much later. In 2020, Redford lost his son James to liver cancer at the age of 58. James had faced health struggles since birth, including a liver transplant in the 1990s. He went on to become a filmmaker and advocate for organ donation. But while awaiting another transplant in 2019, he was diagnosed with bile duct cancer. A year later, his wife confirmed his passing, describing his life as beautiful and impactful. Redford's grief was described as immeasurable, mourning not only a son, but also a man whose work carried forward his own legacy of passion and purpose. For Robert Redford, tragedy has been a constant shadow. Childhood illness, reckless, near-death dares, the early loss of his mother and uncle, the death of a baby, the murder of a loved one, the mysterious drowning of a friend, and the unimaginable grief of outliving two sons. Yet somehow, he transformed all that pain into art. His performances and his directorial work often carried the weight of those experiences, with films like Ordinary People, exploring the very fabric of grief and silence in families. Redford once reflected that he grew up in a culture where feelings were never expressed, and much of his art has been his way of breaking that silence. It is this mixture of private sorrow and public brilliance that makes Robert Redford not just a Hollywood legend, but also a man whose story reminds us that no amount of fame or success can shield you from life's darkest turns. He carried those scars into his work, turning grief into unforgettable art. But tragedy never really let him go, and just when you think his story couldn't possibly hold more loss, the final chapter of Robert Redford's life reveals one last heartbreaking twist: his death. Robert Redford's death and the shocking truth from his autopsy. When the news of Robert Redford's death broke in the early hours of September 16th, it felt like the end of an era. Robert Redford, the golden face of Hollywood for more than half a century, was gone. He didn't just star in movies, he defined them. From Western outlaws to political thrillers, from sweeping romances to gritty dramas, Redford's presence was unmistakable. His career stretched across generations, and even in his late 80s, he refused to fade quietly into retirement. In fact, only months before his passing, Redford was still working. He slipped into a cameo on AMC's Dark Winds, a series he helped bring to life as executive producer. And just a few years earlier, he stood alongside Marvel heavyweights in Avengers: Endgame, reprising his role as Alexander Pierce. For a man approaching 90, his energy seemed unstoppable, his passion undimmed, which is why the announcement of his death in September 2025 left the world stunned. At 89, Redford passed away at his beloved home in Sundance, Utah, the mountains that had long been his sanctuary. Reports first described it as peaceful. He had died in his sleep. His longtime publicist confirmed the family's grief, calling him a man who lived surrounded by love, whose absence would be felt deeply. Tributes poured in from across the industry. Meryl Streep described the loss as if one of the lions had passed. Ron Howard called him a cultural giant. Others simply called him what he had always been, a legend. For all the brilliance, Redford's story wasn't without shadows. His early years were reckless, even self-destructive, nearly derailing him before his career began. Yet he turned those mistakes into stepping stones, reinventing himself into one of the most respected names in cinema. He is survived by his wife, 2 daughters, and 7 grandchildren, a family who must now carry his legacy forward. Still, what exactly happened in his final hours remains a mystery, one the world can't stop asking about. When you hear the name Robert Redford, what's the first film or moment that comes to your mind? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also click on the next video shown on your screen. You will enjoy it.